Hello, everyone. Okay, yeah, it's working. So my name is Francis Godwin. I'm the director of the Office of Manufacturing Quality. So unlike most of the colleagues who have been speaking, I am not part of the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, but we are a sister office, the Office of Compliance, and the office that I run is the Office of Manufacturing Quality. We deal with firms in the red zone, as Cindy was talking about. So what that means is that what my office deals with is only a very small proportion of the drug inventory. It's about 5% of the firms in the inventory are out of compliance, and then they're interacting with us. So let's jump right on into it. So there's 3 objectives that I'm going to go through today. The first one is to give a quick update on the implementation of ConOps when it comes to the surveillance portion and the regulatory actions. I'm going to talk about recent trends in OTC drug manufacturers, and then also talk about API repackagers, which, if you've noticed, Cindy just talked about those 2 sectors, repackagers and OTCs, having higher non-compliance rates, hence why I'm talking about them today. So the concept of operations is something that affects OPQ, it affects ORA, it affects compliance, and there are 2 goals that really come into play for the Office of Manufacturing Quality and surveillance inspections. The first is the goal is to create and implement a formalized and streamlined facility evaluation and inspection program, and it has 2 primary outcomes that we want. The first is what's called the 90-day classification letter. This is something that came out of the GDUFA 2 commitments, but we do it for all firms, and we want to try and get these classification letters, which usually come with their EIRs, within 90 days of the close of the inspection. And then the other part of ConOps, at least from a compliance standpoint, is that we want to get compliance actions, whether they be import alerts, warning letters, what have you, to facilities within 6 months of the inspection so that we can facilitate faster corrective actions. And so these graphs are basically the metrics that deal with the OMQ portion of the concept of operations. On the left side, you have a pie chart. It says value percentage, but I know what they are. In fact, what they are is that for the EIRs that are submitted to OMQ, about 95% of them, we are getting the associated classification letters to firms within our allotted time frame. So when ORA submits an inspection report for us to evaluate, whether it be a surveillance inspection that's gone poorly or a for cause, we are reviewing them within 45 days and getting the classifications to the inspected firms. But what I'm more happy to talk about is on the right side. This is a bar graph that actually shows the number of warning letters that OMQ has either issued or cleared for issuance by ORA over the past 5 fiscal years. And you'll notice there's this dramatic increase, right? In fiscal year 15, we issued 19 warning letters. In fiscal year 19, which just ended a few weeks ago, we issued 98. So a dramatic increase in the number of warning letters that have been issued. And I'll get into why shortly. But at the same time, the time it takes to issue these compliance action has dropped dramatically. The red line is the median time frame for issuance of warning letters over the past 5 years. And what you can see is that 5 years ago, it was taking about 10 months to issue a warning letter to go through the process and the necessary things to get a warning letter issued. And now we are doing it in about 4.5 months' time, which is actually right around what our ConOps goal is for OMQ issuing letters. So we're issuing more warning letters, and we're issuing them faster, which is good for protecting and promoting the public health. So I'm going to give you your challenge question, and then I'll give you the answer later, so I just want to plant the seed. So the first question is, do OTC and non-application drugs have to meet the same manufacturing standards as those you would find in NDAs, ANDAs, and BLAs? So think about it, and we'll come back to it. Surveillance inspections, right? This is where the Office of Surveillance selects facilities, ORA conducts the inspections, and part of that is to see who is complying with CGMP. I'm not going to go through this. There was a statement that our former commissioner put out last year when a map was posted that talks about surveillance inspections. If you're interested in the topic, the link is here. It's embedded in the presentation materials. Suggest you read it. But it talks about how site selection in CGMP is conducted. And now I'm going to veer into a little bit of history because it really is what is driving what you are seeing in terms of FDA actions. So before 2012, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act actually had a prescriptive rule that said FDA will conduct biannual, every 2 years, inspections of domestic U.S.-based drug manufacturing facilities. That was what Congress put into the law specifically. At the same time, the law did not specify what the requirement was for foreign manufacturers. So there's this imbalance in what the requirements are. FDA does not have infinite resources, so something's going on. At the same time that the law had this imbalance built into it, the globalization occurred. It started in the late 90s, but it really took off in the 2000s. And all of a sudden, as Cindy pointed out today, we have just about a 50-50 split between foreign and domestic manufacturing. And so what happened is, with the way that the statute was set up and the way that the inventory shifted, there became a large imbalance of who was getting inspected and who had never been inspected. FDA and Congress specifically addressed this issue in 2012 when they passed the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, also known as FDASIA. And FDASIA changed the requirement when it came to CGMP inspections for drug manufacturers to do so not based on time, but according to a risk-based schedule. And that is a lot of what Cindy is talking about when she's saying, looking at the model, look at the intelligence, and figure out who to go to based on risk. At the same time, shortly after FDASIA was passed, FDA took a look at the inventory. And what we found is that there were about 1,000 facilities that were overseas that had never been inspected by FDA. And Cindy had talked about kind of some of the things you see when a facility has never been inspected. And as we're looking into this, FDA commits and decides that we're going to inspect these 1,000 facilities over 3 years and get the entire inventory inspected. And this is wrapping up pretty much as we speak. So, what did we see when we inspect all of these foreign facilities that we've never been to before? Well, it's a little bit of good news and a little bit of bad news. The good news is 75%, or about 3/4 of these foreign facilities, were found to be compliant. And when I say compliant with CGMP, I mean that the classifications were no action indicated or voluntary action indicated. On the flip side, 25%, 1 in 4 foreign facilities that we had never inspected were found to be non-compliant with CGMP. And that gets them the official action indicated, or OAI classification, and then they are interacting with the Office of Compliance in terms of next steps. So, who are these facilities? Well, if you talk about a firm that's in the inventory that's shipping drugs but has never been inspected, you're not talking about application products and application facilities. If you have an NDA, a BLA, an ANDA, you have to be inspected prior to distributing these drugs, right? So what the facilities we're talking about here, and I'm sorry that the presentation is not showing the percentages, but I can tell you what they are. OTCs represent over 80% of these foreign facilities that had never been inspected that were found to be non-compliant, right? So monograph products, USP products, unapproved drugs, homeopathics, your over-the-counter drugs in that category. The APIs that are mentioned here, a lot of these are APIs for pharmacy compounding or APIs also for OTC. They represent about, I'd say, 15%. And that blue sliver that doesn't have a describer on it are non-application prescription drugs. If you're looking at this, you're probably thinking ophthalmics more than anything else. There's a lot of ophthalmic drugs. Some of them are prescription, but they don't have applications. When we ran into them as well. So higher OAI rate, more warning letters, more import alerts, hence the dramatic increase in the number of actions that are going on. And if you look at where the actions are going on, it's pretty much everywhere. These are the warning letter heat map for the past 5 years, and you can see that the warning letters are pretty much tracking with where the facilities are. The highest number of warning letters were for firms in the United States, because that's where the highest percentage of our inventory is. India, China, Europe, and then everywhere else. And this is really a testament to the Office of Regulatory Affairs going everywhere in the world to inspect drug manufacturers wherever they are. So, when we look at the OTCs, there are 5 big trends. Data integrity is one that we found, facility issues, lack of raw material and finished testing, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, glycerin, and then contract manufacturing. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to focus in on 2 of them. The first one is lack of raw material and finished drug testing. And this is a quote from a recent warning letter. The redactions are trade secret because we have the requirements of the Trade Secret Act to deal with. But basically, your firm released your finished OTC drug product X without testing for the identity and strength of active ingredient. Without this testing, you do not have scientific evidence that your drug meets the specification it is purported to represent, right? Saw this in a lot of OTC manufacturers. On the flip side, we saw the same thing when it came to them doing raw material testing, where they weren't doing raw material testing. This is just a quote from a warning letter, which says your firm failed to test your incoming API and other components for identity or other quality attributes prior to manufacturing. We tend to see these two charges together quite a bit, where a firm doesn't test their material, doesn't test the raw materials, doesn't test the finished product. You have to wonder about garbage in and garbage out and the quality of the drugs. And if you're a foreign firm, you're pretty much on import alert if we see this pattern, by the way. But what's really worrisome when we're talking about the OTCs and the lack of raw material testing is glycerin. This is from a recent warning letter. You failed to test incoming components, just like a lot of other OTC sites. But, for example, you did not test each lot of glycerin used as a component to determine whether DEG or EG was present. And it's underlined here, but this was actually in the warning letter, and we don't use words like this in warning letters very often. DEG contamination in pharmaceuticals has resulted in lethal poisoning incidents in humans worldwide. And what I want to talk about with glycerin is something that goes into history, right? So diethylene glycol is also known as antifreeze. Okay, it's in your car. It is very sweet. Glycerin is also sweet, and glycerin is sometimes used as a sweetener. And over history, we have seen nefarious actors substitute glycerin and put DEG in it instead to basically make a cheap buck, and then patients get hurt. It happened multiple times throughout history. The most recent times was in the mid-2000s in Central America, where DEG found its way into the glycerin supply chain. And there's a guidance that talks specifically about this, and the link to it is here. But what we found is that in the supply chain, distributors and brokers, repackagers were not telling their customers where the glycerin was coming from, and this led to a weakness in the supply chain where nefarious actors could sneak DEG into the glycerin, and then patients were hurt. And so just want to point out that that's kind of what's there. And so to meet CGMP requirements, and the same CGMP requirements exist if you're a BLA holder, NDA holder, ANDA holder, OTC, homeopathic, the GMPs are the same for everyone, is that if you have glycerin as a raw material, it's not just that you have to do identity testing on each shipment, you have to do it on each individual container of glycerin that you receive to make sure diethylene glycol is not there. And this is just a quote from the guidance that's out there on this. So, the challenge question, okay, hope you guys are paying attention. Do OTCs and non-application drug manufacturers have to meet the same standards as application drugs? Who says yes? Yes, that is correct. Who says no? All right, good, very good. You passed the first test. Yes, the answer is yes. The CGMP requirements are the same regardless of application type. There may be nuances if something is sterile or if it's an API or if it's a pill or extended release in the science, but the GMPs are the same across the board. So let's talk about repackers, the other industry sector that Cindy flagged as being problematic from a compliance standpoint. So the second challenge question, and we'll get to the answer later, do API, repackers, brokers, traders, what have you, have to tell their customers where the original API came from and who was the original API manufacturer? So keep that in your head, and then we'll jump right into it. So we talked about the GMPs are a lot known for finished dosage form of the CFRs. For API, it's a little bit different. Active pharmaceutical ingredients are drugs under the Act, as are a lot of things. And so the statutory authority of 501A2B, which defines CGMP for drugs, is where it comes from. FDA has not promulgated regulations for APIs, but there's the ICHQ7 guidance, which from a compliance standpoint, we use when we consider expectations for active pharmaceutical ingredient and CGMP compliance. So, the warning letters that have been going out, the dramatic increase, this is the various colors, and it talks about the different swaths of different types of manufacturers. In red, you see the OTCs driving the dramatic increase in finished dosage form warning letters, right? They're predominantly taking over because of us inspecting the uninspected. The orange, it's a little both where you have firms that make APIs and OTCs. There's one warning letter to a pet manufacturer hiding in 2018. But on top, you have the blues, which are the API manufacturers. And you'll notice that over the past 4 or 5 years, the number of warning letters to API manufacturers Hasn't gone up, hasn't really gone down. It's kind of, it's varied a little bit, but there's no dramatic shift. But one of the things that we have seen in the API warning letters recently is this, and this is obfuscation or hiding of supply chain information. So in July of this year, the FDA put out a public press release. It was in July, and it was related to what we were seeing in the API repackaging space. We've issued multiple warning letters. If you can Google the statement and find it. We put all the warning letter names in there with links to them. But we talked about how we were warning repackers for distributing pharmaceutical ingredients, including opioids, mind you, for putting consumers at risk with violations of manufacturing standards. And we have a quote from Dr. Woodcock, who is our center director. I'm not going to read it out loud, but I can point out one thing after the dash says, including identifying the original manufacturer of the drugs, such as opioids. We kept on running into APIs in the supply chain where if you just picked it up, you couldn't figure out where it came from. And so we had issue with this, and we've been working to address this. So when we talk about API repackers, your business model here is that it's usually a small facility. They will buy API from larger manufacturers, repackage them into smaller amounts, and then ship them off to customers. This usually hits unapproved drug manufacturers as well as pharmacy compounders, even some application products, by the way. We've seen these supply lines touch that as well. But some of the things that we saw was, obviously failure to meet CGMP, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it, but failure to investigate complaints. They would get complaints of contamination or subpotency. They wouldn't do anything about it. Their C of A's didn't have complete information. They're making the repackaging multiple APIs, in some cases hormones, in some cases beta-lactams, sometimes cytotoxics, things that are very potent, and they don't have their cleaning validation programs in place to be handling multiple APIs to ensure they don't have cross-contamination of one active API into another. But other things that we saw were really unnerving, and this is the failure to maintain traceability of the API throughout the supply chain. We've actually gone to API repackers and said, who made this API? And their answer was, we don't know. We couldn't find out when we bought it. And that got that firm in trouble. They got a warning letter for that alone. They actually sometimes don't even retain the documents about where the API's pedigree was and who they shipped it to. And that was a problem. But the big problem that we ran into from a trend standpoint was they were distributing API, including opioids, fentanyl, morphine, you name it, where they would ship these APIs to customers, but they were not saying where the original API came from. And this really can compromise the supply chain accountability. I just talked about glycerin. One of the failure modes in the glycerin history was that brokers and repackers and traders were hiding where the material came from, and all of a sudden something could sneak in. And so this has really hit into the compounding pharmacy supply lines quite heavily, and we've been very active in this space. So I talked about ICHQ7 and how that is the benchmark that we utilize for evaluating compliance with CGMP. And there's two quotes that I'm going to go through quickly on Q7. So first one is, well, before I do that, Q7 talks mainly about API manufacturing, but there are sections on repackers, traders, distributors, and what's required for them. So it's not a big section of the guidance, but it's a very important one. And it says agents, brokers, distributors, repackers, relabelers, etc., should transfer all quality information received from an API or intermediate site to the customer, and from the customer back to the manufacturer. And what this really means is that if a customer complains to the repacker and says, I have a quality problem with this, the repacker needs to tell the manufacturer so they can investigate under CGMP. And on the flip side, if a manufacturer says, I have a problem, oh, we might need to recall this, the relabeler then needs to tell their customers that this drug's been recalled. So the information flows back and forth throughout the supply chain. And the second part of the guidance that really touches on this is that this is right out of the guidance. The agent, broker, trader, distributor, et cetera, who supplies the API to the customer, provide the name of the original API manufacturer and the batch number. It also has some other things about the certificates, et cetera. So this is something that, from a CGMP expectation, the agency expects of API repackers. So, question for you. Do API repackers, brokers, traders have to tell their customer the name of the original API manufacturer? Yes. Very good. Yes, they do. Yes, and that is correct. Under CGMP, the repackers, et cetera, are required to tell their customers the name of the original manufacturer, and this is because supply chain integrity is directly linked to patient safety. And with that, I'm done, so we're going to hand off to Tara so she can talk about quality metrics, and then we'll be back for the panel. So thank you.